It's been such a long time since I've taken all the notes that I've taken in terms of video ideas that I'm not sure what ideas I've dropped into something else that I've talked about. Um, and I'm not really sure about the content of those notes. So I'm going to be making some kind of vague comments on uh, in this case, I want to talk about writing and how it's changed in I can't even say my in the recent years. I can't quite say in my lifetime, but I did get to see it. I saw it before it happened. So when we think of writing, what immediately comes to mind is movies. Technically, there's more than that, but that's really the forward facing stuff for people in terms of when we see writing translated impacting on ourselves. And if you want to say something like society, you can get away with saying that. Now, writing in movies, I think everybody has noticed more and more that it's been um, that movies which have found their success. So, what we used to call blockbusters, they found their success um, by being remakes or kind of being parasitic to nostalgia for old stuff, for other stuff, for stuff that might have been quite successful, for things that might have been um, really influential on movies themselves, let alone culture. Now, I am primarily thinking in the box that contains the United States and Canada. Now, we share a lot of movies. Canada can't actually really tell whether something is even Canadian or not. It's a thing. We have movies. However, let's say large scope, large budget movies that come from the United States just kind of wash over everything. And because the of all things, the accent that is used by the characters is going to be kind of the generic whatever American stuff, and Canada has no real um, I can't say something like bias, but we have no concern at all um, for accents. We don't really map that to like we'll know that it's American, and there's no concept of it not or being a problem at all. It's just not in consciousness. And I suppose it's because we've been neighbors for so long that I can't even say that it's grown to it's like something we've grown comfortable with. It's just it's not we we don't think on it. It's not like we don't care. We just don't think on it at all. I suppose if you were to pin a Canadian down and actually ask them things like that, they say, yeah, oh yeah, it all stands out. I can tell when somebody's you know from various locations in the United States in terms of that character in that movie. And you'd probably get the same person to admit when that actor is forcing an accent because it just seems out of place having any accent whatsoever. Probably because Canadians kind of don't really have, in terms of just the primary English, don't have an accent. Um, so you can't say like the difference between Boston and Texas. Vaguely, whatever the heck that means. One's a city, one's a huge area, right? But um, let's say Boston and Dallas. Um, that there's a very remarkable difference there that even Canadians will know. But in terms of Canada, like Toronto and Vancouver, um, English as a first language, native all the way back, more or less in terms of um, like European, let's say a few generations or something like that, where there's no kind of ancestral language influences. the English is going to be exactly the same. And that's the vast majority of Canadians, with everybody who, let's say, eschews the use of an alternate language to make it a strong secondary language. Anybody who's in that kind of boat always just sounds the same. And maybe there are stories of kids that go and visit their family in Australia or Britain or something like that, where they'll kind of pick up the accent for a little while when they come back here. Maybe I hear stories like that, but I've never met anybody like that. And it's just like a couple people online, and they tend to be very visible because they're already presenting themselves, and they're already very, very vocal. What was I talking about? I was talking about writing. Awesome tangents. Maybe I should hold those tangents for later in a video so as to like actually appear like I'm capable of being focused. Otherwise I'll just well, this is what I'm like. So if you went away before now, right, you can imagine all those other people who just couldn't quite follow me. Fine, I suppose. I hear a lot of YouTubers say they would rather have a small, I think what they mean is like medium-sized, a sustainable audience that is on board with like the authenticity of who they are as a, well, you want to say creator, or maybe as person or something like that. And that they would rather not have a massive audience of people that just kind of like are okay with their stuff generally. They'd rather have some people that are like on board. And I think maybe that's an easier way to get rid of nervousness or something for doing what I'm doing right now. Maybe my not caring about driving a certain kind of audience way that's not capable of actually keeping up. Because technically speaking, even the way I just derailed myself right now matters to what I'm going to talk about, just because of the way I think and talk. So I'm talking about writing, and the phrase I like using is writing has become parasitic to nostalgia. So nostalgia, let's say something, you can pick any, you can bias yourself by looking at any movie that's a remake, not necessarily recently, but in the past 10 years, and seeing how there was something that was popular, and it was not exactly archaeologically mined, but the nostalgia that persists from that was just taken advantage of to get people hyped, get people talking, to almost guarantee eyeballs, almost guarantee people talking about it. And that will so strongly impact I'm still talking about movies, so strongly impact a movie's success that it's part of a formula. It's just entered into the industry. And because movies are not about making culture, not about making art, they're about making money for all the stuff that is the most visible. And investing, you can imagine investing in a movie and getting 50% of your investment back, right? So you put in $1, you can imagine getting back $1.50, $2, $3, depending on domestic and international, and maybe there's other media services that are just generically going to be, we used to say something like DVD sales, but there's more than that, right? And that's ignoring, and depending on what the tier of investment somebody has in a movie, and when I say somebody, I mean whatever group. Maybe there's also some impact from toys or something like that, right? So we know Disney thinks like that. So the fact that somebody will float an idea like, oh, we should have a live action remake of pick cartoon, that's going to be that if the source is good enough, the target Parasite movie is going to do well enough. It's going to do more than break even. And these days maybe it requires some luck, but with enough skill, it's going to make a significant amount. It's just got so much of a leg up that on a new In video games, we'd say a new IP. A nostalgia rooted movie has a such a groundwork, such a basement. It has concrete already poured that you can assemble a new movie, a new building kind of on top of that, and that immediately gives a kind of a comfort, a guarantee for the return on investment. It's not actually guaranteed, especially because a lot of those are just terrible, like objectively terrible as films, let alone terrible in that they're disrespectful to the source material, or however you want to talk about that. And I could list off a bunch of movies that were utter abysmal failures in terms of, well, respecting the audience, where the audience is people that saw the original movie, maybe in the theaters, grew up on it. Or I could say it's abysmal in terms of just filmmaking in general. So I could talk about technical aspects of filmmaking. I could also talk about acting and things like that. But in terms of writing, which is what this video is supposed to be about, in terms of writing, the writing ends up being pretty lazy because it's borrowing from existing lore. It becomes a really big problem when the borrowing from lore, it's like the writers are themselves. We can imagine that the writers themselves are fans. Some influence in there is like that, and they're leveraging too much of the nostalgia. So they're leveraging too much of the existing understanding of the lore, and that becomes absent in the movie, which just feels wrong. Yet there are movies which will constantly revisit the origin story of something like a hero. So Batman's a great example of that one. It's like, oh, it's another Batman. Oh, we've got to have flashbacks talking about the loss of family. And there's other superheroes where that's happened, and those other superheroes didn't turn out to be like that. And that isn't quite visited properly to help the audience understand, help the movie understand why that character turns out that way. So there's just the nostalgia just assumes that people already understand a lot of that backstory, and it just kind of essentially pays a writer's version of lip service for explaining. There's kind of like emotion that's built into a lot of the original explanations from the original kind of source material, source writing. Batman's older than obviously its own movies, but it's become not just parasitic to the comic books, which themselves maybe they're stealing from mythology or other comics or what have you. And certainly later soft reboots and what ifs and stuff like that of even in comic form have done the same thing with other comics. Certainly as writing gets used and reused, like tearing down an old temple to a forgotten god to build houses, which are then torn down to build walls, which are like there's the original stuff is torn down and rebuilt to service that contemporary, let's call the contemporary authors. Each generation of contemporary author will go and will tear away what they want, even when they're disrespecting or eroding the value of the stuff they're taking from. This is like lazy writing. So you might do that through books, and then or comic books, and through generations of it, then maybe it gets adapted into film after film after film after film, and maybe it gets soft rebooted or hard rebooted, or maybe they're just really dumb and they try to continue along and then just insert a different actor. They just swap somebody out. That was really confusing in I was primarily really confusing in The Matrix, which did that with one of the characters. And I didn't, when I first saw that, it was in The Matrix 2? I guess it would have been The Matrix 2. I can't remember now. It was so confusing. I didn't fully, it was really bad. And the same thing happened with, I know it happened with Harry Potter, but where they just swap a character out and call it the same thing. And because it's a different new actor, and maybe they kind of act they still act a little uniquely to that person. The role swap, the swap in actors is noticeable somehow, and sometimes it can be quite an impact. So there's stuff like that it's a thing. Sometimes it's unavoidable because a person dies. These days, a person dies and they're replaced by computer graphics. Like that's creepy. That's really weird, but that's a thing. But I do want to talk about the kind of reuse of the building blocks of writing, of nostalgia. I think I've done that well enough. I can't think of anything else that I really want to talk about, other than I suppose I'm ranting about my childhood being turned into profit. There is something about, I mean, I can talk like that. I don't technically care because I don't have enough of a, the stuff that happens in the past is in the past and it's forever, right? My adult self doesn't really care about my childhood self having experienced certain things, and my adult self is being reminded by a remake, for example. That's never going to kind of sully the context of my original experience as a child of something. I know other people, they're lured by the implied or explicit statement that let's say a movie remake is going to bring back those same feelings. I really do. I understand when other people they invest something of themselves in that notion. Like a new movie that comes out now really matters to some people when it's a revisit of something that was impactful in their youth. I get that. It doesn't happen to me. It will, after the fact, matter in the sense that I just find it. I am offended as somebody who cares about writing. I'm offended at how incredibly bad and lazy that often is. It's one thing to take inspiration from something that was successful and revisit it with today's, let's call it, superior acting or superior effects or whatever. It's one thing to do that, and I think that's incredible when it's done. And often they don't even talk about the fact that certain movie is based on a comic book. Like, how many people know that Blade is based on a comic book? That's now an old movie, although maybe it's going to be remade. Who knows? At the time, nobody knew, and if somebody mentioned it, I don't think anybody would really care either. And if maybe it's because the source material wasn't popular enough, certainly not in the mainstream, for people to go like, wait a second, the original character was just like a normal guy. What is this about him being like this weird different kind of vampire? And like, nobody would, like, back then nobody would have cared even if it was brought up. Nowadays I think people are more sensitive to the perceived need for exactness. In when you're stealing from the old material, it should be like the old material, which I suppose is true if the marketing keeps leaning heavily on the idea that, oh, this is just as good as that, it is a reboot of that, then absolutely they need to not just pay homage, but really, really strongly mimic everything in that original thing. But if they do that, then they disrespect it by subverting expectations. If they do something as dumb as that, then they've fleeced an audience for their nostalgia, and they haven't presented anything interesting and new. So it just comes across as bad writing, as lazy, as an investment-based endeavor, not as actual genuine art. And there are movies who they'll let people, they won't tell anyone, that they won't rely on the marketing value of something being, let's say, a remake. but it'll be a remake. It'll obviously be a remake. They'll even say it's a remake, but they won't put it in their marketing. They won't push it. It'll just happen to be that. It'll happen to be that. And to let the nostalgia take care of itself, because that isn't what's important. What's important is they lean on it like it's a good new IP, like it's a good new movie. Hopefully that's a standalone movie, and it just happens to be based on something else that was wildly successful, perhaps. And that kind of movie has the opportunity to be its own thing, unique, with its own unique characters and plot, that doesn't have to be a carbon copy, doesn't have to be a remake. People will assume that nostalgic writing is meant as is supposed to be a remake. But by avoiding the parasitism on nostalgia, an endeavor will have weaker benefit from that fact, and will be able to take advantage of they're diverging from the source material enough. They will be able to make sacrifices in terms of the necessary changes from the source material to go off in the direction they want to explore with the new release. And I think a lot of movies, they might do both. They might really be parasitic to the nostalgia, and they'll be so disrespectful to that source material by going off on their own direction. I think that's the problem that I and perhaps many other people have in terms of, let's say, movie writing. Okay, so that's something interesting for me to at least have thought about.